welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Kemper Donovan.
I'm Catherine Brobeck.
And this week, we are discussing Five Little Pigs. It is Catherine's week. It might as well be her birthday. She has been looking forward to this day for so long.
Not gonna lie, everybody knows that. But you know what, Kemper? We're gonna find out if you also enjoyed it, which I think is maybe more interesting. My only path here was to be potentially disappointed. So we're gonna find
This is true.
We're gonna find out if I am disappointed and if you are gonna stop making fun of me.
Did it live up to the hype for Catherine? And was Kemper's experience significantly different from Catherine's? And if so, how? These are the questions we will be seeking out. Let's just get right into it because we have so much to cover. Catherine Brobeck, tell us a little bit about the publication history of Five Little Pigs.
So it was first published in the U.S. in May 1942 as Murder in Retrospect, and then in January 1943 by Collins Crime in the U.K. as Five Little Pigs.
Let's talk about our victim, or perhaps victims. Our first is Amyas Creil, a rather famous painter and Lothario of the 19-teens and 20s, who was poisoned to death 16 years ago, ostensibly by his wife, Caroline, who was then convicted of his murder.
And then we have Caroline Creil, who died in prison where she was obviously serving, a life sentence for the murder of her husband. The question here and the question of the book is she the other victim?
Indeed. By the way, given the fact that we have a 1942 publication date, 16 years earlier would be 1926, i.e. Agatha Christie's very, very dark year, culminating in her disappearance. Just interesting that is the timing here. Yeah. Let's talk about our suspects. As the UK title would suggest, we do have five, in addition to the deceased Caroline Creil, of course. So going through those five suspects, first up, we have our first little pig, this little piggy who went to market, Mr. Philip Blake, who is Amyas Creil's best friend and a stockbroker. That would be the market that he went to. And he also seems to harbor an immense dislike for Amyas's wife, Caroline.
And then we have this little piggy who stayed home, Mr. Meredith Blake, who's an eccentric country gentleman who owns Handcross Manor, which is the estate next to where the Creils lived. And once upon a time, he occupied his vast amounts of leisure time by becoming an expert amateur herbalist.
The piggy who went to market and the piggy who stayed home are brothers. It's pretty obvious, but Christie is referencing the Five Little Pigs nursery rhyme. I personally hate this nursery rhyme reference in the book. I think it cheapens what is otherwise a not at all cheap book, and I much prefer the U.S. title, Murder in Retrospect.
I actually have an edition that is called Murder in Retrospect, and it leaves off the chapter headers that are in Five Little Pigs.
Oh, it does, of like, this little piggy cried, wee, wee, wee.
Yeah, so it comes up as a reference at the beginning when Poirot is thinking through the suspect list. For me, in the Five Little Pigs version, the chapter headers are the thing that really, really is annoying.
It was the wee, wee, wee one that made me cringe. For my money, the only nursery rhyme novel we've covered thus far in which the nursery rhyme has worked is And Then There Were None. Did not work with 1, 2, Buckle My Shoe.
No,
does not work here with Five Little Pigs. In any case, moving on to our next little piggy, this one who had roast beef. That would be Elsa Greer, now Lady Didisham, after marriage numero tres. But at the time of Amyas's death, she was a young social climber, unmarried, and she was seducing Amyas and determined to get him to leave his wife and marry her.
And then we have this little piggy who had none, Cecilia Williams, who was the family's governess. She primarily looked after Caroline's younger half-sister.
And then finally, we have the little piggy who cried wee, wee, wee all the way home, and that would be Angela Warren, who is in the present day an archaeologist and a celebrated lecturer on that topic, but who at the time was a disfigured and troubled teenager. Hence the wee, wee, wee business, which is just such a stretch and so upsetting. In any case, let's talk about the world as it appears to be.
Poirot receives an appointment at his flat, and it's a young woman who's elegant, she's expensively dressed, she has a proud, refined bearing, she's full of life. Her name is Carla Lemarchand. and she's a 21-year-old Canadian, and she's engaged to be married to her fiancé, John, but her family had her hold off on getting engaged until her 21st birthday, which, that seems ominous. And it is, because they, in fact, had a letter for her.
Yes. You see, Carla Le Marchant's name is not actually Carla Le Marchant. It is Caroline Crail, exactly as her mother was named. And this letter is a letter that was written by the first Caroline while she sat in prison, telling her child that no matter what anyone else said or what anyone else thinks, she is innocent. She did not murder her husband, Amyas Crail, and that she doesn't want her daughter living with the burden of thinking that her mother is a murderer.
Carla/Caroline has come to Poirot because she cannot bear that her husband-to-be, who says he does not care at all, but she can seem to think that every time they argue, he seems to get a little bit nervous, as though, I guess, she's going to poison him. And so Carla will not have that be her life. She wants children. She wants a happy, healthy family. She doesn't want this threat of inherited madness to haunt her life. And also, on top of that, she believes her mother's letter. She says to Poirot, regardless of what she finds, she needs him to investigate, to look into this past, and to reinterrogate the case and its principles, because she wants a concrete answer to at least pay justice to her mother's letter to her.
It's a little old-fashioned, this notion of she wants to be able to tell her fiancé that her blood is not tainted, right?
Right.
Yet, she's also a very modern woman who, when Poirot says, well, if I'm going to seek out the truth, and if the truth is not to your liking, are you going to be okay with that? And she flings back her head and says, yes, of course I'll be okay with that. The little she remembers of her mother is that her mother was actually a very truthful person. And
right.
She has a great respect for the truth as well, which is why she finds it hard to believe that her mother would be lying in this letter. Her mother was not a sentimental sort of person who would just tell her this to make her feel better, which is immediately very interesting and specific as to
right.
the dynamics between this character and her mother who died and this complicated backstory. And we're only I'd say 10 pages into this novel, and it feels like an unusual Christie. There's a lot going on here.
But there's also a really interesting degree of honesty between Poirot and his new client. There's a level of transparency between people's motivations at the beginning that's interesting.
No, absolutely. It reminded me a little bit of in Sad Cypress, Poirot has the same conversation with the doctor who wants him to acquit Eleanor. And he says, well, what if what I find out isn't to your liking? And he kind of just says the opposite. And he's like, well, it better not be. Or he at least says, I don't think it will be because she can't be guilty. There's not the same sort of leveling that's going on here between the characters.
Right.
It is interesting. So just to make all of this easier, since we did mention there's a lot going on here, we're going to give a brief rundown of the case and the conviction of Caroline Crail. Essentially, and this all happened 16 years earlier, Amyas Crail had been engaging in one of his flings with Elsa Greer, who he had been painting. So she was a model in his latest painting. Not that she was a professional model, but he had been painting her portrait. And she was more aggressive than previous flings had been and was becoming increasingly intrusive on the family life at the Crail country estate, which is called Alderbury, and is very, very obviously based off of Agatha Christie's own estate, Greenway. Here's how Christie describes the Battery Garden in the book, which is where Amyas painted Elsa and where he was murdered. The Battery was an artificially cleared plateau with battlements set with cannon. It gave one the impression of overhanging the sea. There were trees above it and behind it, but on the seaside there was nothing but the dazzling blue water below. And I actually have this lovely picture book called Agatha Christie at Home by Hilary McCaskill, which includes a picture of the Battery Garden. So I will take a screenshot of that and put it on our various social media accounts, so you can see the real life version, which is so similar. The only major difference being that the body of water Christie's Battery Garden overlooked at Greenway was the River Dart. And in the book, the garden is overlooking the sea.
Caroline Crail had been overheard increasingly arguing with Amyas, even though their entire relationship actually was about arguing and getting back together again. It's said repeatedly in this book that they fight like cats and dogs, and that they had been doing so since the time they were children, because they've known each other that long. The day prior to his death, however, was unusually heated. seemingly over Elsa Greer. Elsa had told Caroline to her face that she was going to rearrange the furniture in the sitting room once the house was hers. And it's because Amyas is going to leave Caroline to marry her, and there's nothing else to be done about it. And Amyas, his reaction is to be furious that Elsa overheard that Caroline says that she'll kill Amyas before she lets Elsa have him. This is what we at least hear from the legal side of things. Apparently, Elsa had also overheard them fighting about her or about Amyas and his women, and the brothers Blake overhear them fighting over sending Angela to boarding school. Basically, all they've been doing is fighting, and this is what's brought up at the trial, and this is like the primary motivating factor as to why she apparently killed her husband.
So on the day of the murder, Meredith Blake realized that a vial of homemade coneine, which is extracted from hemlock, it's hemlock poison, that this had gone missing from his laboratory. Again, he is an amateur chemist. And later that day, Caroline took Amyas his afternoon beer from the house, as all the beer in the Battery Garden, where he was painting Elsa's portrait overlooking the river and this very dramatic landscape that's described very specifically. All of that beer was warm. So she handed Amyas the cold beer, poured it into a glass, and Amyas drank it off all in one go, which is what he was known to do with his beers, and said, "Everything tastes foul to me today." Then later in the afternoon, Caroline and Miss Williams, the governess, find Amyas on the sofa near his easel, dead.
Right. So the missing bottle of poison very conveniently was found in Caroline's dresser drawer, empty, with only her fingerprints on it. And the bottle of beer found near Amyas had been wiped clean, and his hand clearly had been held back around it. Apparently they make much of this at the trial about how unnatural the fingerprints were. Also because naturally the bottle should have had Caroline's fingerprints on it too, since she brought the bottle to him. The other thing is that the actual drug was found in the glass beside the bottle.
Right. It was not found in the bottle. It was found only in the glass.
Right.
So Caroline insisted she had taken the coneine from Meredith Blake's laboratory to kill herself, not to kill her husband. She did admit to taking it and being the one that had stolen it. The defense ultimately had to turn on the idea that Amyas had used it on himself to kill himself as an elegant way out of this marital mess and this affair that he had found himself in. And this failed to convince pretty much everyone, including the jury, because Amyas, by all accounts, was just not the type of man to kill himself. He was full of life and rather selfish, and just not anyone,
selfish.
Yeah, not anyone who would kill himself. So Caroline was also not doing herself any favors in that she was so detached from the entire proceeding of the murder trial that she basically didn't even defend herself. And the only reason she wasn't sentenced to hang was due to the extenuating circumstances of Elsa Greer being so dislikable as the, quote, other woman. Obviously, no one's saying that she was justified in doing it, but people just feel so badly for her because they think she was just being tortured by Elsa Greer over these weeks at her own home, where Elsa Greer was just parading it in front of her that she was going to steal her man. That is why Caroline gets a life sentence and not an execution, but she dies within the year, her first year in prison, and her child, Carla, is sent to live with her aunt and uncle, the Le Marchands, and she takes their name in Canada, and she has a happy life there until she is given that darn letter from her mother and goes to Poirot.
Right, so we're back in the present day with Poirot, who now has to figure out how to look into a case that has no physical evidence and where all the memories of the events are 16 years in the past. And so, of course, the only way to do this is by interviewing the players in the investigation and the suspects. And so he starts, naturally enough, with the investigators and the lawyers and the other members of the legal profession. So our summary that we just gave, we get all of that information up front from these people. That's where most of this information is coming from about how it was presented at the trial. Right.
The first part of this book, before we actually get to the witness testimony from the Five Little Pigs, is a kind of a battery of lawyers of different personalities and stripes, and they're all rather entertainingly portrayed. They essentially lay out the case and the bare facts. So moving on to the Five Little Pigs themselves and their witness testimony, which is really where the heart of this novel lies. We're going to also streamline this part of things, since otherwise we would be summarizing this novel for 3 hours. Because what happens in the book is that Poirot has an initial oral interview with each pig, one by one because they are all still alive 16 years later. He approaches them mostly under the false pretense of writing a book, which is actually really funny.
Right.
He's like, I'm writing a book on crime. What he then does is he solicits a written statement from each pig. So in the book, we have the 5 oral accounts of Poirot's interview with them, and then 5 written statements after that. We are just going to cover what we find out from each little pig all at once.
Right, because essentially how this book structurally works is that, a decade before Kurosawa's very famous film Rashomon, which is what everybody thinks of when they think of sort of repeating narrative like this is entirely how the book is structured. It's the same anecdotes, the same versions of this story told with different levels of shading over and over again until you get a huge layering of the narrative.
I have to say, one thing I was struck by upon my rereading is how subtle the differences are. And I think it's so believable here how the accounts are different in key and crucial ways, but they are also very similar. There's a lot in common, and the differences are just subtle, and it's very masterful. You get this complete picture after going through each of these 10 accounts, 5 and then 5, with these slight differences here and there. So we're going to talk through what we get out of each witness account generally. First up, we have Philip Blake. He's kind of a xenophobic dullard, and he condescends to Poirot, and he's by far the least likable character, I think, within this story. And he's overtly vicious about Caroline. He says that she was this cruel grabber of men. She made Amyas's life hell, and she was a terrible mother. And he talks about how there was this incident, and this is mentioned by pretty much everyone, in which when Caroline Creel was 19, she actually threw a paperweight. He might actually be the one who said that it was a crowbar, because some people,
he does say it's a crowbar.
Yeah, so Philip Blake claims that Caroline Creel threw a crowbar at her half sister when she was still a baby, thereby wounding her and scarring her for life. And it is true that Caroline Creel did throw something at her. Everyone else says that it was a paperweight, and I think we can be pretty confident that it was in fact a paperweight. But she did it out of spite and jealousy when she was 19, which is not super young, but also not fully grown necessarily. I guess she was a young 19.
And it's implied that she was incredibly close to her mother and an only child.
Again, 19, not 9. But
no.
I had not remembered that. I was struck by that on my reread, too. I was like, she was 19? That's old.
But I think that is perhaps one of the reasons why Caroline Creel does what she does for the rest of her life.
Absolutely. We'll get there. So we also learned that he overheard the tail end of an argument between Caroline and Amyas the morning of the day Amyas was murdered. Caroline said, "You and your women, I'd like to kill you. Someday I will kill you." And then after the argument, Philip came upon Caroline murmuring to herself, "It's too cruel." He also mentions having seen Amyas staggering around a bit in the morning, well before Caroline poured him that icy beer.
Up next, Poirot takes a little visit to Meredith Blake, who's still living in their country house. And so as a result, Poirot approaches him with very high-end social letters of introduction. Because he knows
Lady Mary Lytton Gore from 3-Act Tragedy.
I know. And Meredith Blake, we got some of his thoughts, and he's like, well, she doesn't seem really like the type to interact with like a foreign detective. But he lets him in, and both of the brothers are pretty horrified that he's brought this girl down to their house and that it's just being flaunted in front of Caroline's face. Amyas, though, really brushes aside the concerns, and to Meredith, it seems very callous. He insists that he knows that this is his masterpiece, and everyone will understand that he was right when it's done, and that all of these women just need to leave him alone so that he can finish it in peace. It's his primary concern. The art is really the only thing he cares about.
We also learned from Meredith Blake that in the course of an argument between Caroline and Amyas, which seems to have been about Angela being sent off to school, Amyas told Caroline he'd see to Angela's packing. Philip also references this argument in his account, but he doesn't get too specific about it.
Last but not least, Meredith asks if Poirot wants to see the painting, because it's Meredith Blake who has it. And it's apparently a stunning painting of Elsa Greer. The thing about it is that Poirot sees something in Elsa's eyes that leaves him almost afraid. and he describes it as arrogance and triumphant anticipation.
Up next, we've got Elsa Greer, now Lady Didisham. Poirot is quite struck by what a tragic figure she cuts. The first thought that leaps into his mind when he sees her, having just seen her youthful portrait at Meredith Blake's, is how, well, dead she looks. Not haggard, her skin is still smooth, she's as beautiful as ever. She's only 36 after all, having been 20 at the time of Amyas's death. But Christie finds several impressive ways to describe her corpse-like effect. Perhaps the most impressive being, she was like a flower overtaken by untimely frost, still in bud, but without life. Such a great image. We also have her gray eyes being described as dead lakes, and Poirot even quotes the Duchess of Malfi, she died young, which will very much figure in the final Christie novel we shall cover several eons from now, Sleeping Murder. There's also a little sequence toward the end of his interview with Elsa where she shows him a love letter Amyas had written to her. She thrusts it on him, and Poirot, quote, had a sudden poignant memory of a child he had known who had thrust on him one of her treasures, a special shell picked up on the seashore and zealously guarded. Just so had that child stood back and watched him, proud, afraid, keenly critical of his reception of her treasure. First off, I'm very curious who this child is, who Poirot knows so well, but it's such a great sequence because it shows the vulnerability of this brittle woman, the layers to her, and it makes her feel real. This is some of Christie's best character work here, ever. And I would recommend to all our listeners out there that if anyone among their acquaintance ever dares to claim that Christie wrote only cardboard characters, that they should whip out this chapter. That would be chapter 8 of Five Little Pigs, and perhaps even the 2 to follow, which we will get to in a moment, and to just start reading aloud. Moving right along, she insists to Poirot that the tragedy of Amyas's death ruined her, and while one could die like Juliet with a knife to the chest, she had thought that her purpose was to keep on keeping on. She impresses on Poirot that Caroline Creel was an awful monster for not letting Amyas go, and that she hates Caroline because she killed him and she ruined Elsa's life by just not giving him up. And in her narrative, we mostly learn a little bit more about her relationship with Amyas. We learn that Amyas begins their relationship by telling her how fond he is of his wife, even as he's taking Elsa to bed. We also find out that she began pushing Amyas to tell Caroline that he was going to leave her, but that Amyas just kept on shoving it aside and saying, no, I'll figure that out later, because he could only focus on his painting. And he just said, I just want to focus on this. I'll handle everything else later.
So up next we have Miss Cecilia Williams, who is the governess, and she now lives in, I know, Kemper, this is one of your favorite descriptions, but she lives in this tiny, faded, threadbare flatlet, decorated with prints of Dante and Beatrice and of Venice and of Botticelli's Primavera. And it's all very interesting. She's an interesting character. And Poirot looks at this and looks at her and decides that he's just going to cut to the chase. He does not lie to her. He tells her about Carla and explains what he's doing. And we learn from Miss Williams primarily about Angela, who we don't necessarily get a lot of up until this point, and how she was so spoiled by Caroline, and how she was alternately incredibly spoiled and then incredibly argumentative with Amyas, and that as a result she was constantly getting mad at him and pulling pranks of some kind. For example, filling his drinks, which, as we've mentioned, he threw back in single gulps, with salt. She put slugs in his bed. She notes the arguments about sending Angela off to boarding school. And so she leaves Poirot when they're in person with 2 things. One, that Amyas absolutely deserved to die for what he did and how he behaved. She is adamant about it. There's very little sympathy for her about his murder, artist or no artist. Also, she tells Poirot that Caroline absolutely did it, and she knows for certain.
She has a very cliffhangery ending to her interview, and we get the answer as to how she's so certain in her written narrative, where she tells Poirot about Angela once again being naughty, as per usual, after having fought with Amyas the previous night, how she was pulling beers out of the refrigerator when Miss Williams and Caroline arrived, and that Caroline took one of those beers from Angela, who looked red-faced and guilty about something, and that's the beer that she brought out to Amyas. And then the really important thing is that after Miss Williams discovered the body with Caroline, she ran out to get help, and she actually met Meredith Blake and sent him back to get help, and then she went back to Caroline and the body. And what she saw there, and she's never told anyone this until now, this is the first time she's telling anyone, she saw saw Caroline wiping down the bottle with her handkerchief and pressing her husband's dead hand around it. And to her, that is proof positive that Caroline was guilty, and she doesn't blame her one little bit.
Not at all. And also, Amyas Crale was a bad artist. She has very strong opinions on that subject. Anyway, last but not least, we have Angela Warren, and we learn two important things besides the fact that she's now this very successful, interesting archaeologist. But we learn that she thinks firmly that Caroline was innocent, and she gives Poirot the letter that Caroline sent her from jail.
My darling little Angela, you will hear bad news and you will grieve, but what I want to impress upon you is that it is all right. I have never told you lies, and I don't now when I say that I am actually happy, that I feel an essential rightness and a peace that I have never known before. It's all right, darling, it's all right. Don't look back and regret and grieve for me. Go on with your life and succeed. You can, I know. It's all right, darling, and I'm going to Amyas. I haven't the least doubt that we shall be together. I couldn't have lived without him. Do this one thing for me. Be happy. I've told you, I'm happy. One has to pay one's debts. It's lovely to feel peaceful. Your loving sister, Cara. One of Christie's more beautiful letters inserted in the course of a mystery novel. And we will get to the import of what was said, or perhaps more significantly, not said in that letter when we get to our resolution.
And then we also find out that the real reason Philip Blake hates Caroline so much is, shocker, he was in love with Caroline. And Angela has reason to believe that at some point they had an affair when presumably Amyas was cheating on her with somebody else. And we also get from her perspective that she desperately wanted to testify at the trial, but she was kept away.
Those are our accounts from our 5 little pigs twice over. And now it's time for some clues to get us to the world as it actually is. I'm just going to run through these here because there aren't too many of them, and they're surprisingly simple for such an otherwise sophisticated novel. We've got lots of Christie classics here. Number 1, the inherent faultiness of witness testimony, always a favorite of Christie's. In all these overlapping accounts of various arguments that Caroline and Amyas had, there's only one argument that is overheard by one person alone, and it is a crucial one both for its content and timing. This is the argument on the morning of the murder, in which Elsa Greer claims to have heard Amyas telling Caroline he was leaving her for Elsa. Philip Blake overheard only the tail end of this conversation in which Caroline said, "You and your women." So the deduction here is that if we take a moment to think about what "you and your women" means, given Amyas's past, what Caroline is doing here is actually classifying Elsa as another of Amyas's past flings, i.e. the women he cast aside when he was done with them. And while Elsa has an obvious motivation to lie about what she overheard in this conversation, where is Philip Blake's motivation to lie here, especially given how much he hates Caroline? Because the exchange he overhears actually goes toward exonerating Caroline, and that it seems Amyas was not going to leave Elsa, but instead throw her over like he did with all his other women. So at the very least, we should consider the possibility Philip Blake's account is the accurate one, whereas Elsa very well may be lying.
The other fight that we actually do get corroborated multiple times is the fight in the house where Elsa tries to provoke Amyas into telling Caroline to her face that he's already told her that he's going to marry her. And Amyas, in multiple accounts, doesn't.
Right. Clue number 2, and this is a meta clue. It has to do with Christie's love of love triangles, in which the original pair remain true to themselves. We saw this first in Death on the Nile. Simon seemed to have fallen out of love with Jacqueline in favor of Lynette, but he in fact stayed true to Jackie. And then in Evil Under the Sun, Patrick seemed to have fallen out of love with Christine in favor of Arlena, but he did not. And what if we actually had the same pattern here? What if Amyas seems to have been about to overthrow Caroline for Elsa, but what if that's not true? What if Elsa was actually going to be tossed aside, just like Amyas's other women? If so, that would be an excellent motivation for murder, i.e. jalousie, which is why this is such a devious clue, since it inverts the identities of the culprit and the innocent when comparing it to Christie's 2 other love triangles in those previous novels. Clue number 3, the inherent faultiness of witness testimony, part 2. Philip and Meredith Blake both overheard Amyas and Caroline arguing alone in the Battery Garden about Angela, or that's what they assumed anyway, since Caroline told them after the fact that they were discussing Angela. Philip doesn't make mention of what Amyas said, but Meredith says Amyas shouted irritably that it was all settled, he'd see to her packing. Well, our deduction here is a tricky one, and it's pretty hard to get here, but for a super astute reader, one may wonder why in God's name the selfish artiste, Ammius Crail, would concern himself with the packing of his wife's teenaged half-sister, especially since she has a governess. I'll see to her packing, however, sounds an awful lot like I'll send her packing. Here is the inherent faultiness of witness testimony, so perhaps Meredith Blake mischaracterized what he heard. And in this case, perhaps it was Elsa they were talking about, not Angela. And perhaps this is yet more proof that Ammius was intending to cast aside Elsa very shortly. And our final clue, such a Christie classic, has to do with timing. Philip Blake saw Ammius staggering before Caroline poured that cold beer. And Meredith Blake, in his testimony, also notes that Ammius had been complaining for a while of stiffness and soreness, though the timing of when that stiffness and soreness was happening is vague in his account. But most importantly, we should note that Ammius said everything tastes foul today when he drank that cold beer poured by Caroline, which to an astute reader would indicate he had already drunk something foul-tasting. The deduction here is that the poisoning happened earlier than it seemed to. We've got ye old temporal deception here. And in that case, who was alone with Ammius the entire morning? Who had ample opportunity to poison him? That's right, Elsa, the same woman whose portrait, completed on this very day, the day of the painter's murder, so troubled Poirot when he saw it with the arrogance and triumphant anticipation of its subject, Elsa Greer. It's worth noting that all these clues, other than the meta-clue, rely on parsing key lines of dialogue for their true meaning. These are some excellent clues. There's no specialized knowledge required here. We're not in the realm of the mysterious affair at Styles or anything like that. Far from it. If anything, they're simply asking the reader to do what she should be doing anyway, i.e. reading closely. It's all very satisfying. At the end of all of this, we have everyone brought together for a grand drawing room denouement. This is Poirot at his finest. He tells everyone what happened.
So Elsa Greer murdered Ammius. She'd gone after him and was so self-assured and so smug about her ability to get whatever it was that she wanted. She assumed that his assurances of love and marriage were her getting exactly what she wanted, like she always did. And unfortunately for her, what Ammius wanted was a great painting, and she was a very good subject. So he flattered her, and he played into her belief that she'd won him because all he wanted was her sitting there so that he could paint her. You know, Ammius actually didn't really lie to her until later because he told her he was married and also he loved his wife, or, you know, as she puts it, he was very fond of his wife. And that was true. He never at any point intended to leave Caroline, and all of his comments and asides about vaguely regretting having fallen in with Elsa, which we hear from the Blake brothers primarily, they were not about the fact that he was head over heels smitten, but about the fact that he had this clingy narcissist who wouldn't leave him alone and who was mucking up everything when all he wanted to do was finish his painting.
And then what Philip Blake heard in terms of Caroline talking about it being too cruel, Philip Blake made an assumption there that that was Caroline talking about herself, but Caroline was actually talking about Elsa.
Right.
At that point, because she felt bad that Elsa was going to be yet another one of these women who Ammius was going to throw aside.
Ultimately, what happened is that Elsa saw Caroline steal the poison the night before, and legitimately so. Caroline did steal the poison with perhaps a little bit of thought that maybe she should just have it in case she wants to kill herself. And so she sort of, on a spur-of-the-moment impulse, did steal the poison and did hide it in her dresser drawer. And Elsa, after having heard that she was going to be thrown out very shortly when the painting was finished in like a few hours, basically, goes upstairs to get a sweater, swipes out the poison from Caroline's dresser, and then poisons Ammius's warm beer. And critically, she poisons it in the glass.
Although, and this is one of the places where the plot gets a little wonky, which we'll be talking about in a little bit when we get to rankings, in that Elsa poisoned an entirely separate, earlier, warmer beer she gave to Ammius down in the Battery Garden. The warmth of this beer is what led Ammius to request a cold beer from Caroline. We actually don't know how Elsa poisoned that earlier beer, whether it was in the bottle or the glass. What we do know is that there was some separate receptacle, a bottle or a glass or potentially both, that would also have had the remains of conine in it, but which apparently escaped notice because only the bottle and glass Caroline served Ammius was tested after the fact. We are never told anything about Elsa disposing of this receptacle receptacle or doing anything with it. It's a little hard to believe that the police wouldn't have tested everything down in the Battery Garden, but in any case, Elsa used a fountain pen filler to draw out the codeine from the bottle she found in Caroline's drawer, thereby preserving Caroline's fingerprints and not making any of her own. And she put the bulk of the poison in that earlier beer, then dropped the last few drops of the codeine into the glass of cold beer Caroline had served to Ammius while he lay there incapacitated and nearly dead. Ice cold indeed. She then went up to lunch with Meredith Blake and trod upon the fountain pen filler, turning it to powder on the pathway. That was discovered, and we are told about that. But Elsa got really lucky in that Caroline happened to serve her husband this second beer. Otherwise, she was merely relying on the police finding the bottle of poison in Caroline's drawer, which is admittedly still a solid frame-up. All right, so let's bring this home. This isn't definitely what happens, but this is heavily implied that...
It's heavily implied.
That as he's been gradually getting more and more incapacitated, feeling stiff and sore and staggering around so that people think he's drunk, Ammius has figured it out. That he realizes Elsa must have poisoned him earlier that day. Unfortunately for him, being the macho, impatient man that he is, he didn't want to admit to ill health before it was essentially too late to raise the alarm. So now here he is in the Battery Garden, all but incapacitated, sprawled out in front of his painting, as he was wont to do, still able to see, and perhaps to move his arms just enough to add a few finishing touches to this painting of the woman who he now knows has murdered him. And brilliant artist that he is, alters his painting, hones the eyes of his subject so that the painting becomes what Poirot sees when he looks at this painting in Meredith's house, i.e., the look of a vengeful, triumphant murderess watching her lover die before her very eyes. And that is what Poirot found so troubling about it. I guess he was a really good artist then. He certainly does belong in the Tate if he was able to pull that off.
He has not one but two paintings in the Tate, right?
Right. Although, as Miss Williams says, so does Mr. Epstein. So, poor Jacob Epstein. He's very much done in by all of his artistic eccentricities.
Yeah, but being unusually cranky to people and not willing to come to lunch on time, etc.
Right.
Nobody
and drinking his drinks in one slug.
Oh, slug. Was that pun intended?
It actually wasn't, but I'll take credit for it.
Up at the house, as we know from Miss Williams, Caroline saw Angela messing with the beers in the fridge. And she knows that that's something that Angela routinely does. And she also knows that Angela and Ammius have been fighting tooth and nail in the last day. And so when she finds him dead, the beer bottle and the glass are next to him that she brought down there that Angela clearly had been handling in the refrigerator. And so she immediately assumes that Angela had poisoned him out of spite for being sent to boarding school. So she wipes down the beer bottle. And note, and this is important, it's actually the thing that Miss Williams doesn't tell anybody, but it's actually what proves Caroline Crail innocent. Because Caroline Crail wiped down the beer bottle, not the glass, even though the only poison was in the glass. And it's because she assumed the beer bottle was poisoned. She then goes with a suicide explanation, but when that doesn't work, she allows herself to be charged with the murder to protect her little sister and pay back this debt of having wounded her forever and blinded her in one eye.
When she was 19 years old.
Yep. Yeah.
And of course, Elsa, now Lady Didisham, appears to have gotten away with all of it except, and it's a huge except, her life has been ruined because she didn't kill them. The person she ended up killing was, in fact, herself. In the final pages of this novel, which I would argue are the strongest final pages of any Christie novel we've read thus far. If we recently read Christie's finest opening ever in The Body in the Library, I think this is a strong contender for her best closing ever. And we will discuss this shortly in the rankings, but I think it proves that we are currently in the 40s at the height of Christie's powers when it came to the execution of her novels, her prowess as a stylist. There's a convincing argument to be made, I think, that the height of her powers as a conceptualist was a bit earlier, back in the 30s when she was reeling off brilliant hook after brilliant hook. The would-be victim did it. Everyone did it. The earlier murder or murders were merely meant to obfuscate a later murder. The inspector did it. One of the actual victims did it, etc. But as with most writers, I think it took more time for her to hone her skills as a stylist, and we see it in full bloom here. Again, for those doltish snobs who think Agatha Christie was a bad writer, point them to this book.
She gives one of the all-time great villain monologues at the end. She says, he told her that he didn't care a button about me. He had cared, but it was all over. Once he'd finished the picture, he'd send me packing. She'd nothing to worry about, he said, and she was sorry for me. Do you understand what that did to me? I found the stuff and I gave it to him and I sat there watching him die. I've never felt so alive, so exultant, so full of power. I watched him die. She flung out her hands. I didn't understand that I was killing myself, not him. Afterwards, I saw her caught in a trap and that was no good either. I couldn't hurt her. She didn't care. She escaped from it all. Half the time she wasn't there. She and Amy's both escaped. They went somewhere where I couldn't get at them, but they didn't die. I died. Elsa Didisham got up. She went across to the door. She said again, I died.
Let's just finish it out because we have two more lines, and I love the image that it ends on. In the hall, she passed two young people whose life together was just beginning. That would, of course, be Carla and her fiancé. No tainted blood there. The chauffeur held open the door of the car. Lady Didisham got in, and the chauffeur wrapped the fur rug around her knees. The end. The image of a rich woman getting entombed in her, fancy car by the fur, getting wrapped around her knees and just going on to live out the rest of her cold days in her mausoleum of a mansion with her husband she doesn't care about. Oh, it's so good. It's so, so good.
Weirdly enough, she almost confesses to Poirot, or she more or less confesses to Poirot earlier. When he first meets her, she more or less says the same thing. Yeah. He reads it initially as her saying, well, my life was ruined because
I lost the man I loved.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it is. And that is, in fact, what happened. She just happened to be the one who killed him, but she did lose the man who she loved. Before we get into our rankings, we should talk a little bit about the adaptation for this novel. And we should mention that Christie did adapt it herself as a play.
Without Poirot.
Without Poirot. It was called Go Back for Murder in 1960. Also a better title than Five Little Pigs. Yeah, she edited Poirot out of it. She actually replaced him with a young lawyer who ends up falling in love with Carla, who then ditches her obnoxious fiancé at the end for him. But apparently this play was terrible, and it actually got such bad reviews that it deeply upset Agatha Christie. Her agent wrote saying maybe you should give theater a rest for a while and get on with a new novel. Not all of these theatrical adaptations went so well for Agatha Christie, so it's sad that such a strong novel would, not be adapted as strongly by her. In any case, that does exist. This was also adapted in French for The Little Murders of Agatha Christie more recently, but we will not be covering that adaptation. We are going to focus on the Suchet adaptation. It was adapted in 2003, and it was the first episode of season/series 9. And it's a fantastic episode.
Yeah, and we're into, I would say, the dark era of the Suchet adaptations, especially in this one.
But it works because this is such a dark, the source
book.
Material itself is so dark. There was no sort of stretching that they had to do. Suchet actually talks in his book, Poirot and Me, about how this was the first episode in which he himself was a producer, and he was privy to every meeting and decision now. And he apparently sat in on one meeting about his mustache, which they specifically redesigned to make it look more grounded. And I just mention that because it really is true that if you're looking at an episode on TV, you just come across it in a vacuum, you can usually tell what year it's from or like around which season it's from, both by Suchet's age, but also the state of his mustache. Because if it's more curled up and fanciful looking, it's an earlier season. And if it's flattened out and more, serious and grounded looking, it's a later season. So that was a deliberate decision.
Yeah, I mean, the mustache lost a little of its curl as the series got darker.
Yeah, he got sadder and his mustache got flatter. And then interestingly, in the earlier seasons, they actually made a point of not casting named actors in supporting roles because it was more of this. They had their regulars who formed the family of the show, and then everyone else kind of cycled in and out. But in the later seasons, they were treated more as standalone feature films, and the production got even more lavish, and the actors who they cast got more more and more impressive, and we certainly see that here. I know that Catherine is a big fan of Aidan Gillen, who plays Ammius Crail.
I am, although I don't know. He would have only done Queer as Folk probably before this adaptation.
Right. Yeah, The Wire was just around the corner.
Yes, it was.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Tony Carcetti.
Yeah, and, our dear Littlefinger from Game of Thrones, also much later.
Sure. We also have Rachel Sterling, a.k.a. Dame Diana Riggs' daughter, Toby Stevens, Maggie Smith's son. I mean, look at the pedigree here. Gemma Jones plays Miss Williams. Just a standout cast and quite faithful to the
very faithful
to the original.
They have some big changes in it, but for the most part, it's very faithful to the book. They edit out some of the legal people at the beginning. Caroline Crail is hanged instead of just dying randomly in prison. But I mean, I don't actually mind that change particularly.
I don't mind that change either. And then it's funny because they make a change that I railed against in our Body in the Library episode when it came to the ITV Marple adaptation. There is some homosexuality injected into this adaptation.
But it's almost in the book.
It is almost in the book. I would argue there's two instances of it injected into the adaptation because there is a soupçon of lesbian sentiment in Miss Williams's regard for Caroline Crail, I think, at least, as Gemma Jones brings it to life on the screen.
I think so, although there's a really weird moment even in the book when she is describing, she kept wanting to go up to Caroline Crail's bedroom to comfort her after Elsa had tried to humiliate her.
Oh, yeah.
That's also a little bit in the book.
It's interesting because Laura Thompson, recent Christie biographer, whose opinion I often agree with on a lot in her book, she hated this adaptation.
That's such an odd thing, but go on.
No, it's very odd. She did not like the departures. She did not like the fact that Caroline Crail is executed rather than dying in prison. She found the hanging to be, quote, semi-pornographic. And what she really didn't like was the injection of homosexuality into the episode, which, given how much I railed against that in the ITV Marple adaptation of The Body in the Library, you would think that I would agree with her on that.
However, you read the book? Because
I mean, I think
we're going to go down a limb and say it here. The homosexuality, is not necessarily written into the book, but it gets very, very close to being there.
Yeah. Miss Williams goes on these anti-man rants in the book and has a lot of regard and affection for Caroline Crail. And Gemma Jones, I think, plays that slightly homoerotically in the adaptation, and I thought that it was effective and I had no problem with it. And then Toby Stevens has this really interesting sequence late in the episode where he reveals that he in fact had feelings for Ammius Crail as a child and that he never got over him. And Suchet pointed it out as he thought one of the more effective scenes.
She thought she might try it on.
Oh, Philip. Sometimes I get so lonely I feel I'm going mad.
She always thought she could get what she wanted, but that didn't wash with me.
I think you better go back to bed.
So you see, when I said I didn't like her, I wasn't telling fibs. No.
Merci, monsieur.
Actually, it's not quite true.
Monsieur Blake, are you all right?
It's all such a mess. Always has been. Since we were children, and she was always ready with some snide remark. Ammius and I, we were true friends. She couldn't stand it. He meant everything to me. Everything. Nothing she could say changed anything.
It's Ammius, isn't it? It's still Ammius. You just can't get him out of your head. Do you have any idea how pathetic you are?
Just made me hate her all the more. I trust you'll keep this to yourself.
Of course.
Not that I care much, anyway.
He loved how Toby Stevens handled
I mean,
that
it
scene.
actually, if you look at how it's written in the book, I think that there's an argument to be made that both his animosity towards and interest in Caroline Crail is some degree of transference from his relationship with Ammius.
I totally agree with that, which is why it didn't ruin anything for me. To be fair to how much I railed against the ITV adaptation in The Body in the Library, there it's a much greater leap and it's pointless. And I think you could argue that it's kind of pointless here too. I don't know if it's necessary. I don't know if they had to
I think it,
inject that in here.
Weirdly enough, well, I don't think they had to either, but weirdly enough, it makes more sense than his long-lasting love for Caroline, which is not entirely fleshed out all the way in the book.
And we're convincing. I agree. One of my few, and we'll talk about this when we get to the rankings, which we should probably just transition into right away. So let's talk about plot mechanics. One of the few weaknesses in plot that I found in this book were those little romantic subplots, side plots, whatever you want to call them, having to do with Philip Blake and Meredith Blake. Philip Blake actually secretly loves Caroline and is essentially pulling an Andrew Lincoln vis-a-vis Keira Knightley in Love Actually, minus the cue cards at the end.
But you never talk to me. You always talk to Peter. You don't like me.
It's a self-preservation thing, you see.
I didn't find that super convincing.
The schoolboy pulling your pigtails approach to love.
Yeah, you know what it is? It's not that I didn't find it convincing. I didn't find it all that interesting. And I also didn't find Meredith Blake having the hots for Elsa to be all that interesting either. I in fact found it so boring that I wished it hadn't been mentioned because there's so much else that's fascinating that's going on in this book. So that's why I agree with you. I think changing it the way that they did in the adaptation, you could make the argument that it makes more sense that way. And that's perhaps what Christie was suggesting or what a reader could take from those passages in the book.
I will also point out that I sort of jokingly mentioned this in one of our last episodes about, like, what do we think Christie's feelings were about the sort of lifestyle choices of, for example, like the Bloomsbury Group and other, like, early 20th century, like, literary and artist groups. And there's a lot of sort of libertine behavior in this, an artistic version of it, right? There's this sort of very open relationship between Caroline and Ammius, which is obviously the heart of this book.
I do agree with you, and I'm skipping ahead because it probably goes more to setting a tone, but I agree that I think this is a rare Christie that's a little sexy on the page.
It is, like, surprisingly so.
Yeah, I love this passage, and it's from Elsa's written narrative when she describes the beginning of her relationship with Ammius, and she writes, "He gave a sort of groan and said, 'There are things that are too strong for any man. I can't eat or sleep or rest for wanting you.'" It is clear that they are having sex, a lot of it.
Right. That's also heavily implied in the relationship between Caroline and Ammius, that they fight very publicly.
And they enjoy it.
And that then they disappear, and then they all seem like very contented, for a few days after or whatever, after one of their blow up fights. And it's like they do it as foreplay.
Absolutely. Well, we'll get to setting tone at the end, but on plot mechanics in general, I was very tickled by the way Christie created another love triangle with the same pattern that we saw in Death on the Nile and Evil Under the Sun. And I think that comes from having read these novels in chronological order, in fairly quick succession. Because the brilliant thing she did, as I mentioned, was to invert the murderer and the victim. And that makes so much sense that the innocent parties in the triangle, in this case, are actually the original couple, and the murderer is the other woman. That is the opposite of what we're dealing with in those first two novels. And it's convincing in those two novels, and then she does the reverse here, and it is utterly convincing in this novel as well. I love that. I think it just shows her writerly ability to take the same underlying structure and to build so many different convincing stories using that same foundation. We discussed this a little bit when we analyzed Triangle at Rhodes, yet another love triangle story of Christie's. Not to get too pop psychology about it, I have to think on some level that this story is a bit of wish fulfillment for Christie. I mean, this is a person who suffered through her first husband having an affair with another woman and then leaving her for that woman. And this is now the third novel she's written in which a would-be philandering man has in fact stayed true to his original love. It's just really interesting, I think, when you look at it that way. And seen in that light, this rather dark, cynical novel is almost a little romantic. Not just sexy, but romantic, too. There's just a lot going on here.
The letter that Caroline writes to Angela from prison is a love letter to Amyas.
Life isn't worth living without him anyway, so it's all good. I'll take the blame for you. Don't worry about it.
Right. I mean, that's the gist of what she is saying. And it's also strangely conservative to the extent that one of the things that Miss Williams rails against, right, is that she thinks that Amyas is the devil because he violates everything that's supposed to be important about marriage. And yeah, he does. But, you know, when he says to Meredith Blake, well, Caroline knows what she married, he meant that very literally. And so, yeah, it must be humiliating for Caroline. And that's how it escalates in this because Elsa's in the house. But everything else about it, you do see that they have this relationship, that they have an arrangement. So they actually have a fairly strong marriage. I mean, it's just very unusual.
And I mean, it's funny. I feel like I keep on trying to talk about the plot of this book and we keep on talking about character.
Well,
and that's very telling
yes,
because
it is.
This novel is all about character. And I mentioned Laura Thompson once before, but she has, I think, an excellent summing up of the power of this book. So I just want to quote her here. When she is working at her best, she being Christie, the satisfaction of the solution is intense and profound because it solves the puzzle and resolves the human dynamic. In a book like Five Little Pigs, the plot shadows the characters so closely that the workings of the mystery are the workings of human nature, and the solution depends entirely upon the revealed truth of human nature. What a magnificent premise that a painter should be killed because his model has fallen in love with him, and he is pretending to be in love with her because he wants to finish his painting. A remarkable, satisfying idea. And she's exactly right. Like, this is Christie writing at the height of her powers. Once you understand the characters, once you understand who they are and what they actually want and how they're interacting with each other, you solve the puzzle.
Right.
And that is not what early Christie is like whatsoever. There's no solving the puzzle of character of the people in Mysterious Affair at Styles or Murder at Roger Ackroyd. That is separate from the mystery puzzle that has to be solved. Here, though, they're layered on top of each other, and that makes it so satisfying.
Nobody's wearing a wig here, and there's no bad lighting. You know, we don't have any of that. The only thing that you have, and that's actually the reason why Carla goes to Poirot at the beginning, because Poirot, by reputation, is supposed to be so brilliant that he can look at a case and he can look at the psychology of the participants and he can figure out who done it. And sometimes we don't see that. You know, it's said that about Poirot, right? That he can just sit back with his little gray cells. But a lot of the time, he's actually doing a lot of work.
I always talk about that, the inconsistency of Poirot as an armchair detective. He actually is quite active in a lot of these novels, jumping off trains and whatnot.
Well, I know. Here, it's such a marriage between plot and character. I mean, you can't pull them apart.
I will try to pull them apart, though, for purposes of rankings. So on plot mechanics, I just want to note that this is Christie doing very few suspects again. Often she has a massive cast of characters. It's pretty much everyone in the book. But here we have 5 suspects, really 6, since Caroline is a legitimate suspect for the duration of the novel. And yet Christie has no problem making it a fully absorbing mystery. We saw her do this in Cards on the Table with 4 suspects. And it's just as impressive here as it was there. No side characters tossed in for mere obfuscation, etc. So that speaks very well for this book. This is also Christie doing a murder in the past investigation, and we've already seen her do something similar in at least 2 Mysterious Mr. Quinn stories, The Coming of Mr. Quinn, where the death was 10 years in the past, and At the Bells in Motley, where the incident was a year or so in the past, but where the notion of looking at a crime from the perspective of time passing is actually dealt with directly in the story. We also saw it in Dumb Witness, where the murder happened 2 months previously. So it's an idea that obviously seriously interested her, and I would argue that this is the best she ever did it. Though we should reserve judgment till we get to Ordeal by Innocence, which will likely give it a run for its money on that score. It's also worth noting, I found this very pleasing. There is a symmetry in terms of which characters provide us what information. Solving the central whodunit of Ammius's murder relies almost entirely on the witness testimony of Philip and Meredith Blake, and then solving the crucial side mystery as to why Caroline acts the way she does when she's accused of the murder relies almost entirely on the witness testimony of Cecilia Williams and Angela Warren. Elsa Greer's testimony, of course, is largely useless from a fact-finding standpoint since she is lying. I think it's actually helpful to compare this novel to Sad Cypress because Sad Cypress is a novel with excellent characters and a subpar plot. That is not what we have here. What we have here is a novel with even more excellent characters than what we had in Sad Cypress, and a plot that is servicing them perfectly.
Yes.
But what I would argue is that it is a plot that is servicing them. And the plot itself, when you do divorce it from the characters, is more than adequate. This is not something that I think deserves many deductions in terms of points. But for that reason, it is not superlative. I'm not going to be arguing for the 10 out of 10 that we gave Plot Mechanics to Murder of Roger Ackroyd because of the way that Christie executed that twist. You know, this is a plot that is servicing its characters. And believe me, when we get to characters, I'm pretty sure we're going to be giving a 10 out of 10 to book-specific characters. It would be insane not to.
Right.
But there are a couple of holes. I already pointed out one earlier as to the warm glass of beer that Elsa gave to Ammius, in which she necessarily put the poison, glass and or bottle. What happened to that glass and or bottle? We could always poke holes in any Christie because there's so much going on. But a friend of the podcast, John Goddard, whose book we've used many times before, pointed out a number of these. And there were two that I found significant enough to bring up. The first is this business of the poison being in the glass versus the bottle. And here's the issue. Caroline Crail, the whole reason that she took the fall for this is that she thought that her half-sister Angela did it, right? Angela looked guilty when she was holding this beer bottle, and Caroline took the beer bottle from her, and then that's what she used to pour out the drink to Ammius. But when Caroline obviously found out, as everyone did, that the poison was only in the glass, for Caroline, that would have proven Angela's innocence. Because Angela obviously only touched the bottle. Why would Caroline still think that Angela was guilty at that point?
I agree completely.
That's a hole.
That it's a hole. However, it is said pretty repeatedly. We kind of glossed over the sections with the lawyers at the beginning, but every single one of them essentially says that once they took her in, she wasn't even listening to anybody. She had essentially just given up.
Sure, but come on. She has a daughter. I know that she is going into protective mode here, but the woman has a daughter. This is her life. I find it hard to swallow that she wouldn't have figured that out. And then the other one, what I'm going to call pullover gate, which is...
Well, how Elsa leaves the second time?
How Elsa leaves the second time. Because what's weird about it is that it almost seems like Christie doesn't think it's weird. It almost seems like she forgets that she has her do the same thing twice. Because none of the other characters comment on it or think that it's weird. Because basically what we have to have happen is after Elsa overhears Ammius say, I'm done with Elsa after this painting is over, he comes out and he says, okay, let's go down to work on the painting. And Elsa says, okay, I just have to go up and get my sweater.
Gets the poison.
And that's when she gets the poison. We're also, by the way, told that the reason she's able to find the poison within seconds, not knowing where it was, is because she's a lady. And Caroline Crail is a lady too. And ladies know where ladies hide things, which is also a slightly weak point.
Although, you know, we do see it in NRM when the landlady mentions that she knows that Tuppence has aspirin. And it's only because clearly she looked in the back of her dresser drawer, which is where you would hide something.
And the fact that you're using NRM right now to...
Yeah, no, I know. It's not, no, I'm like, not a good sign. I know. I will say, it seems like a reasonable enough place. Like, you'd put it in the back behind, like, your bras.
No, I get it. It's fine. That's such a quibble, even a smaller quibble, that she's able to find it as quickly as she does. So she does that, and then it's unclear whether or not she actually goes down with a sweater or not, even though she said she was getting a sweater.
Right.
But we know that she got the poison at that point. Then she goes and poses, and then Christie has to get her to leave again because we have to have this conversation between Ammius and Caroline where he says, I'll send her packing. And at that point, her excuse for leaving is to go get a sweater. And then she comes back presumably with the actual sweater. And we know it's September and there's a chilly wind. So like, fine, but it's just weird. The sequencing of it just feels clunky and like something got edited weirdly. For a book in which everything else fits together so perfectly and elegantly, it's annoying.
The case of the missing sweater.
The case of the second sweater or something. It's like, does she need another sweater?
I mean, yeah, maybe she just comes back downstairs and is like, I actually didn't need that sweater anyway.
I guess. Here's where I'm coming out on this, because I did mention that I do love that all of the clues rest on having to read closely.
Yeah.
And actually parse bits of dialogue, which I just think is so brilliant and so satisfying.
I think it's elegant.
I think that it's elegant. And in that plot credibility generally is, are humans acting as humans? Boy, do these humans act like humans in this story.
Yeah.
I mean, these quibbles aside, this story's firing on all cylinders. I don't think we've actually given a 9 in plot credibility to anything yet. I would come out on an 8 for plot mechanics and a 9 for plot credibility. I think you might have been switched on that.
Yeah, I was. And I would be switched actually for the reason that you sort of quibbled with about why doesn't she still have a little bit of impulse towards her daughter. And so that's why I flipped them, because I mean, it is said that they were a couple who were so incredibly in love with one another that there wasn't really room for anything else. But there is room for something else, and it's her guilt over what happened to Angela. So there is room for something else there. And to me, I can't quite believe that she doesn't seem to give even a passing thought to her child with the love of her life, right?
Right.
And so that's where I went lower on plot credibility, which goes into what you were saying about, well, why wouldn't she have cared about Carla when she was sitting in the trial? That's why I had it in the way that I did, that I had plot mechanics as a 9 and plot credibility
I'm
as
fine
an 8.
with that. For me, by far the weakest category in this novel is series-long character, because that would be Monsieur Poirot. The reason why I think it's the weakest is that, first of all, Christie wrote Poirot out of the story herself when she adapted it as a play.
Obviously, that went well for her.
Yeah, right. Well, I don't know if we can blame that on the absence of Poirot, but I keep on bringing up Sad Cypress. It's funny, but there really are so many parallels, I think, between that book and this one. Poirot in this book felt to me like Poirot and Sad Cypress, i.e., he didn't really need to be there. It might actually have been a stronger story without him, because then we could have just focused that much more squarely on all of the fascinating things that were going on here.
I actually think you need Poirot. I disagree with that. I think that you need Poirot in this. One of the funny things that Philip Blake does is that he clearly is dismissive of Poirot because Poirot is a foreigner, but at the same time he's like, oh, everybody knows who you are. Of course we're going to talk to you. It's also why Elsa Greer, or the Lady Didisham, talks to him, because, oh, well, how can she not be curious? The famous Hercule Poirot is now talking to her about this case, you know?
Sure. You need someone who's a well-respected detective. You also need someone who the reader's going to believe is actually smart enough to figure this out based on psychology alone.
Well, and
a murder that happened 16 years ago.
And also, though, we don't have to have any setup. The book opens surprisingly quickly. We get almost no setup at all. We just get Carla coming there. And it really only works if we know who she's coming to see.
No, I agree with that. I mean, I'm not mad that Poirot is in this book. I do love that it just opens up with Poirot getting a client. For such a complicated, sophisticated book, it certainly has such a simple opening and a pleasing one. But, because there's so much else going on, there are so few moments for Poirot to shine. And I always underline these because it's part of what I love about these books, the Poirotian moments that we come across. And I usually have to cut half of them as we're going through our rankings, because I just don't have time to talk about all the moments in which I love Poirot. But I only had one in this novel, which was when Poirot said, "I lead a very moral life. That is not quite the same thing as having moral ideas." Poirot walking the walk, but because he does, not having to talk the talk.
Right.
Here's where I come down on it. I think you came out on an 8.
Yeah, I did.
I would have done a 6. Would you settle for a 7?
I would.
Which is still pretty high.
Yeah, I'll settle for a 7. That's fine. I mean, I think that we'll always have this problem in Poirot books post Captain Hastings, where we don't have necessarily an interlocutor.
Potentially. I don't know if that's totally true, but I hear that. So then let's move on to book-specific characters, which we already talked about because it's a 10 out of 10. I don't think we've ever had better characters in a Christie novel. These characters, they are convincing immediately and throughout.
And they're specific. Little tiny details that I think are surprising, down to like how Meredith Blake's jacket hangs on him.
And this is also where I think the central conceit of this squabbling couple with this other woman who is encroaching and a governess and a daughter. This is something else that Laura Thompson brings up. This is not a story of Agatha Christie's first marriage, but as she writes, it's perhaps the closest she came to telling it in her detective fiction. It has an intimacy, a felt quality. It gives a very real sense of the disrupted household, the quarreling couple, their neglected daughter, and the governess who is totally loyal to Caroline, whose name, by the way, in real life was Carlo. That's pretty close. Can you guess who my least favorite character is?
No, tell me.
It's Carla Le Marchand.
Well, she's almost not a character.
She's more of a catalyst.
Yeah, she is.
When we're introduced to her in those first pages, I think, Christie uses that crutch of she was very alive. I'm beginning to grow weary of that as a descriptor of people.
Christie likes that.
She likes that.
Yeah.
She was very alive. I actually believe Lady Mary's daughter in Three Act Tragedy, Egg
Yes.
Lytton Gore, was also very alive.
I think one of the more interesting things about this book is that we never actually meet them, but Amyas and Caroline Crail seem like fully fleshed out real people who come off the page. That's a specific accomplishment, to take ghosts and make them seem alive, right?
And it's that specificity, too, that you were saying. We had been talking actually a little earlier about how even though Aidan Gillen did such a great job bringing Amyas Crail to life on the screen, he doesn't look the way Amyas is supposed to look on the page because, he's this big, burly, sort of country squire, athletic, larger-than-life man who just happens to be a brilliant painter. That's so odd. I've never seen that before, I immediately can see him.
He's a huge disappointment to his father because he is not actually out there shooting foxes or whatever. I kind of picture him as like an Army Hammer.
Totally. I also love that Caroline is compared a couple of times to Mary, Queen of Scots.
Yeah. Because
I know exactly what Christie means there, that sort of seeming vulnerability, but actually not being vulnerable at all, being a little dangerous. Great
Although
reference.
it's subverted, right? Because she's compared several times to Mary Queen of Scots, and then Elsa Greer is compared several times to Juliet. And the reality is neither woman is what they are being described as. They actually are imbued with each other's qualities at various points, depending on whose perspective it is. Mm-hmm. Which is an interesting thing to have happen. And it's sort of an interesting conflation, which makes it more confusing.
It's like Christie's not only bringing these characters to life, but she's actually commenting on how hard it is to know anyone.
Right.
It's difficult to do that in an effective way in a detective novel, when you're trying to tell a coherent mystery story as well, to get at the ineffability of character. But she does. No. She really does. So it's just on another level here, what she's doing.
I also find this book really interesting because we don't really talk about Agatha Christie. And I don't know if feminism is actually the word that I want to use, but what women do to each other or for each other and their relationships to men obviously comes up quite a bit in crime fiction, given who the murder victims often are. But here we just have it from every single angle, right? We have, the mother, lover, sister, daughter, every single possible angle of how you can define yourself as a woman and how other people view you through those lenses is happening here.
Yeah. Well, what's also interesting, I think, when we bring up feminism is that this is, I think, the first instance of a sympathetic portrayal of a true feminist, because we've certainly seen Christie make fun of feminists before. Looking at you, Ariadne Oliver. But Miss Williams is a feminist. That is stated in the narrative, and Christie does not make fun of her feminist statements. There's actually one line that I found almost moving. Poirot asks her, "You hold no brief for men." And this is what Christie writes. She answered dryly, "Men have the best of this world. I hope that it will not always be so." And it's a total moment. She's saying this in her flatlet with her drawings and her photographs surrounding her in this mise en scène that is the only thing I remembered from my initial read of Five Little Pigs.
It'll never not be funny to me.
Decades ago. Yeah, I mean, I think we talked about this on a much, much earlier episode, but I read this, of course, who knows, when I was 12 or 13 or something. And a couple of years ago, we actually reread this when we were first starting this podcast because we were presenting a paper for some friends of the podcast. And when I started it, I was like, oh, I think I've never read this one before. How is it even possible? And then I got to the scene where Poirot visits Miss Williams and he's looking at the pictures on her walls and he's just musing about her life. It's honestly such a beautiful passage, actually, when he talks about what her advantages are, her sort of meager advantages to her Victorian upbringing.
Right.
This is what Christie says. Miss Williams had that enormous mental and moral advantage of a strict Victorian upbringing denied to us in these days. She had done her duty in that station of life to which it had pleased God to call her, and that assurance had encased her in an armor impregnable to the slings and darts of envy, discontent, and regret. That character just shone through for me, and I never forgot it. And I totally didn't remember any of the mystery or any of the other characters.
I remembered all, this has always been my favorite. So I remembered all of it, but I do think that character is fascinating because of how Poirot almost uses her as an anchor for the rest of the case. He doesn't come to her with any real facade, and I think it's because he inherently trusts her. There's a lot of Poirot thinking about her as a schoolmistress, right? Despite the fact that it appears to be a story about a love triangle and then all these sort of men are involved and like how Amias is the crux of it, it really is a story about the relationship between the women in the story.
So 10 out of 10 for the book-specific characters.
I think that we really kind of covered the setting and the tone for a lot of that, too.
The only reason why I'm going to insist on a 9 out of 10 instead of a 10 out of 10, which we did give to, and then there were none. Here's the ding on what Christie is doing in this novel. It's both its strength and its weakness. The fact that we are reading the accounts of 5 different witnesses, not just once, but twice. That we first get these oral interviews and then these written manuscripts. It should not be as absorbing as it is, and that 100% goes to Christie's craft here, but it does drag a little bit. I know that will be offensive to you, Catherine, but this book is not her quickest read. It's not meant to be her quickest read either. There is an argument to be made that it's her most absorbing, but it is certainly not her most entertaining. She went out on a limb structuring it the way she did, and we've talked before. A friend of the podcast, Brad Friedman, is the one that came up with Dragging the Marsh, which is the issue that so many detective novels have when you just have a bevy of interviews in the middle of a novel where a lot of people say the same thing. Technically, yeah, that is totally what's happening here. I know that she's 100% doing that on purpose and doing it brilliantly, but she's still doing it. And I think you could argue that is a weakness here. I have another ding, which is that nursery rhyme.
Well, I don't think
that leaves a slightly bad taste in my mouth.
I mean,
which it did not for And Then There Were None.
No, the nursery rhyme is misguided here. But I would say about your quibble with the repetition is that our other friend, John Curran, agrees with me on this being Desert Island Christie. And right. I think that it's because you can keep rereading. We've had this conversation before with some of the really great puzzle mysteries. We had it with Murder on the Orient Express, which nobody is going to say is not brilliant in its conceit. But I don't want to bring that to a desert island. I had a hard time. I had a hard time reading it and finding it compelling. There was nothing more to be gained once I knew what the plot was. Whereas the pleasure of this book is that the way that you look at it is through the nuance and the characters, and you have to get that through the repetition is how you fully understand how the crime happens and why it happens, and also sort of the psychology of the perspectives.
100%. No, I agree. And that's why I use the word absorbing. This is her most absorbing novel, and you would want to bring an absorbing novel onto a desert island, right. Not a merely entertaining or scintillating one. But some people read Christie for scintillation, and those people have a problem with this book for that reason. And they're not wrong if that's what they're reading Christie for. It is a valid point. If you're looking for a breezy read, I'm not going to recommend this Christie novel. But again, obviously I have a huge regard for it, which is why I am arguing for a 9 out of 10.
Yeah, I think that's fine.
Okay. And then Stuck in Its Time, we don't really need to discuss because happily there's a couple of weird things about love always coming first with ladies and whatnot, but that's in the mouths of characters and it's all good, right?
Yeah.
I think 0 deductions for Stuck in Its
0.
Time. All right. Well, at long last, in this never-ending episode, that brings us to the end of our rankings for a grand total of 9 plus 8 plus 7 plus 10 plus 9 minus 0, 43 points, putting Five Little Pigs in a tie for first place with And Then There Were None. And here's the thing, listeners, because Catherine and I discussed this a little bit beforehand.
We did.
We are going to put Five Little Pigs in first place.
Oh my goodness. And Kemper promises it's not just because I've had a bad week.
It always makes me happy to make Catherine happy, and I know nothing would make her happier than to put this first, but I thought long and hard about this. I think that And Then There Were None is the obvious choice for number 1 Christie, and there are so many valid arguments for it to be number 1, even compared to Five Little Pigs. However, after rereading this novel and having the long discussion that we have had, and honestly, I could talk about it for another 3 hours. I'm sure you could too, Catherine.
Yeah, we could have had a tremendously longer podcast about this. So,
believe it or not. Yeah, I mean, I think this is the best written novel that we've covered thus far of Christie's. It's the best crafted, just hands down. It just is. The invention that's going on in And Then There Were None, I would argue, is unparalleled. I don't think that we have the same raw inventive power that we have in that novel in Five Little Pigs, but everything else is just...
Well, the structurally, to me, And Then There Were None resembles Soldier Island in that it is bare and windblown and terrifying, and that is all to recommend it tremendously. And it's not to take away anything from that to say that this has a lusher, more tragic quality to it, I think.
What you're saying is more.
In this particular case, yeah.
I think that's fair, and I think that you will come across among Christie enthusiasts a great love for this novel, so perhaps it's not as surprising as I fear among some people that we're putting this above And Then There Were None. However, it is tied, so I'm reserving the right to switch this up.
We will do our re-ranking. In our yearly re-ranking, we can certainly discuss this.
That is the end of our episode, new number 1. I couldn't be more thrilled. I know Catherine could not be more thrilled.
I'm just happy I don't have to go weep now.
You made it, Catherine. You made it.
I know. I survived.
Join us next week for a special episode, actually. We just finished one special episode, and now we're going to do another one back to back.
We're kind of excited about this next one.
Yeah, no, this is exciting. We are doing a themed episode in which we will be covering 2 separate short stories. The Double Clue and The Capture of Cerberus, both Hercule Poirot short stories having to do with one Vera Rosikoff, the Countess Rosikoff herself. We are in and around the Valentine's holiday. Love is in the air, and we thought that it made sense to just explore this character more in the 2 short stories where we find her. We have already come across her in The Big Four,
oh dear.
To mention a novel on the other end of the ranking spectrum for a second.
Yeah, to say the least.
So that will be next time. I would highly encourage any listeners who have strong feelings, if you think that And Then There Were None has been robbed of its first place status, or if you are just as excited as we are that we have a new number 1 title here, we would love to hear from you. So you can always email us at allaboutthedame@gmail.com or find us on Twitter at allaboutthedame. You can find Catherine at Brobcat. Congratulate her on the success of Five Little Pigs in the rankings. She'll be basking in this for days. Our Facebook page is All About Agatha. Our Instagram handle is at All About Agatha. And we would really appreciate it if you took a moment to rate and review us. It will help other people find the podcast, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
Have you made the switch to Knix? Millions of women have made the switch to the revolutionary period underwear from Knix. That's Knix. Period panties from Knix are like no other, making them the #1 leak-proof underwear brand in North America. They're comfy, stylish, and absorbent, perfect for period protection from your lightest to your heaviest days. They look, feel, and machine wash just like regular underwear, but feature incognito protection that has you covered. You can shop sizes from extra small to 4XL. Choose from all kinds of colors, prints, and different styles, from bikinis to boy shorts, thongs to high-rise. You've got to try Knix. See why millions are ditching disposable, wasteful period products and have switched to Knix. Go to knix.com and get 15% off with promo code TRY15. That's knix.com, promo code TRY15 for 15% off life-changing period underwear. That's knix.com.